Good evening, or good morning, or good middle of the day, or good late at night, wherever in the world you are. And welcome to the very first Dinner With, which is a return of D&AD's President's Lectures, but somewhat remixed for our times. So I'm Naresh, I'm a writer, I'm a partner at Pentagram, I'm a co-founder of environmental nonprofit Do the Green Thing, and for one short year, I'm lucky enough to be president of D&AD, where I'm focusing as much of my year as possible on next-gen talent, giving them inspiration and practical advice in what's a very challenging but also a very important year for new imagination. And as part of that focus, I'll be having dinner with very special guests from around the world who've been picked because of their unique ability to inspire a new generation of creative people, as well as older generations like myself. So in a somewhat stretched metaphor, they'll be looking at their career, they're looking at their career across the three courses of a dinner, sharing a starter, which is a project that helped them get their first break, then a main course, which is a project that helped them help define their career, and lastly, a next meal, which is a project by someone else that they've seen recently that's inspiring them about what creativity can and should be going forwards. So before we start, I'd like to call out a couple of people who've helped put this together. There's the lovely Playful Foodie identity by Felix Townsend with all the yellow doodles, a very talented designer who won a New Blood Award in 2020. And there's the intro music, which you just heard, made with knives and forks and pots and pans and spoons, etc., by my brilliant Pentagram partner, Yuri Suzuki, and his team. So thanks to both of them. So without further delay, I'm proud to introduce our first dinner with guest, sharing metaphorical food and real wisdom with us, all the way from his converted barn in Washington, D.C., the remarkable typographer and designer, Tré Seals. So Tré needs little introduction. He's the heart and soul of vocal type and the typographer whose fonts, inspired by protest movements and justice fighters, were adopted by much of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 and were used for gigantic Black Lives Matter street murals in American cities and across the world. He's a fantastic example of what happens when you make a decision to put purpose at the very center of your work. Tré, it's fabulous to have you with us today. So Tré, let's get the dinner going. Please would you share with us your starter, a project that helped you get your first break or taught you something important at the beginning of your career.
So my starter is a sales sheet, actually. I actually started my first business while I was in the 5th grade. I actually started graffitiing people's names on index cards for $3 while I was supposed to be technically running the school store. I was convincing them to buy that instead. And it was really inspired by my parents. I've been watching them run their own business for the past 30 years now. And my allowance was only $1, so there was that. But that experience made me realize that if I can make other people happy by doing what makes me happy, then that's what I need to be doing for the rest of my life. But the idea of graffitiing people's names on index cards really started at this clothing shop, not too far from me, where I saw these people who had an airbrush stand, and they would airbrush t-shirts back when they were cool. And they had all these different styles of lettering that I had never seen before. But at the time, it was the most amazing thing. And that was when I realized that you can actually make money doing art, or what I thought was art at the time. And it was those experiences that made me try to experience in other areas of art and design. And if I could make it, or if I wanted it but couldn't afford it, and I could make it, then I would probably try to sell it. So the graffiti really gave me my start. And from there, I designed bead jewelry, Lego jewelry, posters, tattoos, t-shirts. I ran the comic book section of the school newspaper. And I did all of this from middle school through college. So it was really that experience of graffitiing people's names on index cards for $3 that got me started.
When you're doing all these things, these index cards, t-shirts, bead jewelry, posters, and so on, I mean, this is a very you could say that's a very entrepreneurial instinct. And I was going to ask, is it about being entrepreneurial? Was it about being entrepreneurial for you? Or was it about just expressing your creativity at every moment and every chance you could? Or was it both, do you think?
I think it was a bit of both. Like I said, I had been watching my parents run their own business for the past 30 years, so that entrepreneurial spirit was already in me. And from an early age, I remember my dad telling me, if you want to be successful at something, you either have to do something that no one else is doing or do something different from what everyone is doing. And that just kind of inspired every single thing I did.
Fantastic. Good advice. Good advice.
Definitely.
We've got a question here from Paul McCarney. Paul's asking, I'd love to hear a bit more about your process. How much do you do by hand, on a computer? How long do you usually spend on things? Do you work on multiple projects at once, etc.? Thanks.
Definitely. As far as my process goes, when I'm making a font specifically to sell through Vocal Type, it kind of has different starting points, but for example, I might start with a movement. I might have a movement that I want to highlight through a font, but I'm not sure exactly what the end result will look like. So I'll kind of dig into that movement and find a specific event that's really inspiring and relates back to that movement. And from there, I'll try to find a piece of typography that multiple people have a connection with. That's one thing you might realize with all my work. It's never one sign that one person made. It's always, it might be one sign that 100 people carried or a banner that 10 people carried, because it kind of reinforces this idea of unity. And then once I've identified all of that, I'll try to find an activist associated with that movement and that event to name the font after. As far as like what percent is drawing and what percent is on the computer, it varies from project to project. It depends on how many letters or characters I have access to from the original source material. So like an ampersand, for example, I always have to draw that because no one ever has it in a protest sign.
Right.
Or like a lot of punctuation outside of exclamation marks or question marks. So there's a lot that I actually make myself, and I try to take cues from what's already there to fill in the gaps.
Fantastic. To follow up Paul's question about process, I noticed, I was looking through your Instagram a day or two ago, and I noticed you posted the words "perfection kills distinction." Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Definitely. I think one thing you might notice with all my fonts as well is they all have these little quirks. And I feel like that's what makes them extremely unique. Like the S in Martin, for example, for me, like when I see a font in use, that's kind of what identifies it for me. Like makes me realize, oh, it's just not another grotesque, it's Martin, just because of the shape of the S. And I feel like when you try to make something perfect, it kind of removes all sense of character and humanity. And that's what I kind of feel like is different with my fonts.
Mm. And when you were doing those index cards, obviously you're writing out names, right? And I just wondered whether I think I read a piece by you where you talk about when you were younger, sort of drawing and writing. And I'll ask a question a little later on about writing and words, because obviously that's what typefaces make up. But when were you aware of sort of discovering the power of words? When did that happen?
I think it was in the 6th grade or 7th grade. I actually started writing free verse poetry, aka rap. And yeah, there was just something about making words fit together, kind of like typography, but just written, and how words can pair together to form this sort of rhythm that really intrigued me. And that was when I realized the power of words.
That was a good starter. Delicious. Can we go through to the main course now? So can you share a project with us that's in a way defining for you in your career so far?
Definitely. My main course would definitely have to be the Martin font. That was the first font that I ever actually made and released through Vocal Type. Mm-hmm. And it was inspired by these letterpress signs from the Memphis sanitation strike of 1968. During that time, Memphis sanitation workers, the majority of them Black, went out on strike for safer working conditions and better wages after 2 garbage handlers were killed by a malfunctioning garbage truck. And then Dr. King stepped in and kind of organized this movement, this series of protests. But unfortunately, it was the last cause that he ever had the opportunity to fight for. But during that march, striking workers carried signs that read, "I am a man" and "Union Justice Now." And after his death, the signs didn't only read, "I am a man and Union Justice Now," but "Honor King and Racism."
Yeah.
And it was from those characters that I designed the entire Martin font family. I kind of kicked myself a few years afterwards when I found out that it was actually a font, letterpress font from the 1960, 1959, something like that. But I've seen it twice. I've seen it once in a catalog from Hamilton Woodtype and another one by American Type Founders, but they never really had a name. It was like Gothic insert serial number here. But definitely. And since releasing Martin, it's just been amazing to see how people have put Martin to use. Like since the Black Lives Matter movement throughout 2020, people have used it on protest signs from California to New York to London to Denmark to Australia, street murals and wall murals all around the world. And just seeing the impact that this font has had, it just amazes me.
Yeah, I can't even begin to think what it's like to design that font and see that happen. I mean, I can't, that must be so astonishing.
It still doesn't feel real.
Yeah. Interesting question from Caitlin Brady. And Caitlin says, as a type designer, have you ever seen content or language set in one of your fonts that you objected to? Do you set out with predefined ideas of the usage of the typefaces you develop? I suppose there's ideas and there's hopes as well, or expectations.
Definitely. To be completely honest, there isn't anything that I've seen that I was like, I wish they didn't use my font for that. In fact, I kind of have the opposite reaction when people use like one of my fonts outside of its historical and cultural context. Like for example, there's this one font family called Eva, and it was inspired by Eva Perón, and she was an Argentinian suffragette. And it was actually used by a London-based studio, Aurora Bakui, I believe. I might be butchering the name. But they used it for brand identity for this fourth generation tailor company. And what was so amazing to me about that was it's like when you take one of these fonts with all this culture and all this history and place it in a location where normally the voices of these cultures and their history would normally never be seen or heard of, that kind of reinforces the idea of diversifying design, which is why I started Vocal anyway.
So that for you is on mission when that happens. Something like that is on mission. What would be, to Caitlin's question, what would be, if it hasn't happened yet, what would be an example of usage of your font that is not respectful to the original intention?
I mean, obviously for any hate speech, I would hate to see that. But at the same time, it's, I don't want to call it ironic, but just kind of strange that you would use one of my fonts for hate speech, even though it was designed by a Black designer. Yeah, that would be the only thing for me. And I'm actually working on changing my licensing so that that would actually be against the license.
Yeah, interesting. You can put that in the license.
Definitely.
I didn't know that. That's super interesting.
Yeah, because like we already kind of have this system in the license that says like what you can and can't use a desktop license for. Like you can't use it on a website. So why can't I say you can't use it for hate speech?
Absolutely. That's a really great idea. And you should do that. What is it about typefaces? So you obviously wanted to, you've said you want to bring more diversity to design, or more diverse perspectives to design. And what is it particularly about typefaces? What made you decide on typefaces as a powerful tool for that particular mission that you have?
I always felt like, coming from a graphic design background, that typography was the root of any great piece of graphic design. And if I can change people's understanding of diversity through something that they already purchase and already use, then this message of diversifying design would have a broader audience than if I were to, let's say, make graphics that you can print out with this information.
Right. So they simply are a tool that just goes further. It's just got more application, more application.
Definitely.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about, in between your starter and your main course, you had become a graphic designer and then turned away from graphic design. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey, or paused graphic design? Maybe I'm being too dramatic.
Definitely. So I did this internship back in 2014, and my boss kind of pushed me to explore typography more, to the point where he actually had me draw a 12-foot tall chalkboard mural on my first day.
Right.
And then from there, it was just like typography project after typography project, where he would have me hand letter posters, make a typographic logo for a brand identity. It was like he saw that it was in me. He just wanted to pull it out even further. So even as a graphic designer, all of my logos were typographic. They were rarely ever illustrative. And so that love of typography was always there. But I think it was in 2017, or 18 or 17, I was working on another brand identity through my brand consultancy. And I was so bored. And I was like, I reached out to my client. And I was like, hey, would you mind if I made a custom typeface for you? Because I just didn't feel like working on the brand identity anymore. And that was kind of a turning point for me, when I realized that eventually I want to do type design full time.
Right. What was it about a brand identity that was not fulfilling in a way that type could be more fulfilling? Can you talk a little bit about the contrast there?
Definitely. Well, the clients are way different. So as a type designer, I pretty much only work with graphic designers. I rarely work with non-graphic designers, just because more graphic designers know what type design is and the power of it, and larger corporations know, but that's about it. But as a graphic designer, I worked with all kinds of people. And it was all with the graphic designer, it was like you're paying me to make something that you like. But as a type designer, it's a different proud feeling when people purchase one of my fonts, because you don't have to. So there's that. And it was like the longer I did branding projects, the more every client wanted the same thing. And it got to the point where it was like, I want something modern / classic. And it was like adjectives meant nothing when I was doing these brand questionnaires, trying to pull out what clients wanted. And that was also kind of the decline from my love of branding that kind of contributed to it.
Interesting. And you felt less constrained in typefaces. You were feeling, in a way, a more open field of expression.
Definitely. Like when I was working with branding clients, they always wanted something very professional and something kind of like what they'd already seen before. It was very rare for me to find a client that was willing to choose something different. And I feel like those clients are a bit harder to find. And yeah, that was a huge part of it.
Yeah. Jenny's asked a question about, as an aspiring designer, I'd be really interested to hear more about how you developed your design approach and what advice you'd give to others at finding and developing theirs.
Definitely. There's kind of two parts to that answer. When I was in college, I went to this career seminar, and they had a panel of business owners. I don't remember anything else about that day except for this one business owner who said that every class you take is a future client. And it's been true ever since. And he said that every client, like every industry, has their own language. And it's not important for you to be fluent in every language, but to at the minimum understand those languages. And from there, I just kind of became interested in everything outside of design, which I feel like the best designers aren't just interested in design. But as far as approach goes, I'm a firm believer that everything happens for a reason. So every design decision should have a reason. And by the time you start building up all these reasons for every decision, from typography to color to layout, you basically have this story that evolved out of nothing but reason.
Great answer. A question from Alice. Do you prefer the research process or the refinement of the typeface?
That's kind of tough. I kind of like both because it gives me a break from both of them. So I'm not only doing one thing.
Right.
But I definitely prefer like type refinement.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, okay. I prefer type refinement, but it's not like one of those things where that's the only thing I could do. I would probably need a break and go back and research.
Right, yeah. So it's the crafting part is, and in a way getting the details right, drawing the differences out. You enjoy that.
Definitely.
Caitlin's asking, do you find specializing in typography gives you less variety in your work, or does the narrow focus unlock creativity? I think she's given you your answer there in the question.
Definitely. I think it definitely unlocks creativity. It's actually been a little bit strange the past year since quarantine. I actually haven't only been doing type design lately. A lot of publishers have been reaching out and having me design book covers. They're like, we're going to buy your fonts, we might as well have you design the cover as well. So there's a tiny bit of variety in like type design and actually and typography. So there's a little bit of variety in there.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to go on to, I don't know if this is going to work, by the way, the next course, I hope it does, where I'm going to ask my guest, our first guest, Tré, who's a great guest, by the way, to pick a project that Tré's seen, but that Tré hasn't done. He's seen somewhere else, done by someone else, that actually inspires him about what creativity can and should be going forwards. So, Tré, what did you choose? It's the next meal part.
That was a tough one. I didn't actually choose a project just because there were so many that I just couldn't narrow it down, and I felt kind of bad about picking one project only. But like in a broad sense, I feel like more and more designers are becoming socially conscious, and they're working on projects around social issues. But like you're starting to see fewer and fewer designers like rebranding large corporations, and also working on projects like, let me make this website where you can download free protest signs, or how can I make a typeface that is eco-friendly, it doesn't use up a lot of ink, uses less paper. I'm just seeing a lot of projects like that. And I feel like that's kind of the future of design, is not necessarily a certain type of aesthetic, but just in who we're working for and what we're working for.
Yeah, that's very even-handed of you, not to show a project, but actually to call out a trend you're seeing. I was going to ask a little bit more about design's relationship to social issues, because you've talked in the past of going current focus on race and ethnicity, and you started to work on gender, and you've talked about in the past about going beyond that and starting to focus on other type of issues such as the disability rights issue, or for example climate change. But then sort of said these are issues that our industry is afraid to discuss or sometimes engage with. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that fear that you've observed or that you sense around subjects like that.
Part of it, I feel like, it's either in, like, how can I say this? There's either too much information on the subject or not enough information on the subject. And in the political climate that we're in right now, I feel like a lot of designers I've met aren't sure where to go for that information. Like one thing that has surprised me in starting Vocal Type is the number of designers I've met who never heard about the issue of diversity in design. And you don't hear about it a lot outside of like a showcase of people's work to combat that issue. But I would like to see like more thought pieces around like how can designers create a more eco-friendly world? How can designers be more inclusive? Things like that. I would like to see just more places for people to go, and just more thought pieces and more conversations around the issue. Because I haven't seen a lot of that. I'm not sure if it's fear or not, or if it's just because we're in one of those times where everything you say gets kind of scrutinized. I feel like that's a huge part of it as well.
I think that's.
But I would like to see more open conversation around that.
Yeah, and also I think some of these issues are very large, and they're actually difficult to get. They're difficult to get a complete knowledge set on. I think it's William Morton who calls climate change, climate crisis a hyper object, in that you can't actually quite get not even quite, you can't get your arms around it, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to try not to understand it. I think I really agree with you about the more you can know, the more basics you have in place, and the more knowledge you actually have around the subject, I think the more engageable it is with. So I think I sometimes say that designers or creators who are looking to get involved in the climate crisis, just do some reading. Go and read this book, this paper. Go and check that site out, because I think on the basis of knowledge, you can actually build really strong creativity.
Definitely.
A couple of questions from our other dinner guests on your journey. One from Daniel Bates. He's asking, when starting a career as a creative, how did you try and balance passion projects and the projects that paid the bills? Or did you naturally move towards work which you enjoyed?
I was working a 9 to 5 for about 2 years. And my passion projects were either during lunch or after work when I was tired and could barely keep my eyes open. That's when most of my passion projects took place. But at the same time, it was like that's what made me happy and kind of kept my creativity going when my job wasn't.
Right. And presumably now you're in a place where your job is your passion project.
Definitely.
Yeah, well done. You've done so well. A question from Tom. Any advice on transitioning from a graphic designer to a type designer? Tom hasn't given Tom's surname, so maybe Tom is thinking of doing the same thing. Quietly, secretly.
Definitely. One thing that I've experienced as a type designer, like when I was trying to get into the industry, other type designers are so open and so friendly. There are so few type designers that actually design type for a living that were kind of eager to expand, to grow the community. So I would just say reach out to as many type designers as possible. There are a few organizations like Type at Cooper, League of Movable Type is actually who I took my kind of type design class through, or at least how to use the design software. I would just say be open to reaching out to people.
Yeah, that's a great advice. Just knock on doors, people tend to open. Where is your, a question from Chris, where is your go-to place for research to keep up with design trends? Where do you look?
That's a tough one. I still kind of look to the past, and if not to the past, I look at a lot of different fashion magazines, because I feel like fashion kind of dictates what also happens in graphic design, or what happens in music that kind of happens in graphic design. Like I really hate to admit this, but a couple of years ago, Kanye West came out with this album called The Life of Pablo. And all of his tour merchandise had like this kind of black letter typeface that I believe was custom made. And it was like after that, all that merch came out, all of a sudden I saw black letter everywhere.
Right. On the subject of looking into the past, Emma's asking, can you talk a bit about your process from working with archival references, so photographs, artifacts, etc., through to refining the final typeface. So yeah, how do you go back, find those influences, and make them and actually work them through to the final results?
Definitely. As far as like image sourcing, I either go through a large variety of libraries, or through Getty Images, AP Images, this other site called Alamy. I usually go to them just to search for archival images around the subject. Like I might just search civil rights movement and see what kind of archival images they have that might inspire whatever I'm working on. As far as using those images to create a typeface, there's usually quite a bit of photoshopping I have to do. For example, let's say there's a photo of a banner and it's kind of at an angle. Usually I'll have to Photoshop it to make it look like it's actually facing me, just to get a better idea of like how wide the characters are, how tall they actually are versus how they look in the photo.
Right. That's perfect insight into your process. Thank you. Really interesting question from, I think you pronounced it Roshan. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Who's asking about how great a role you think graphic designers can have in the visuals of protests. So Roshan's asking about balancing the creation of a sense of unity and accessible pre-designed protest material versus individual handmade signs.
It's kind of hard when I look back at old protest signs. They were usually large organizations that would actually work on designing these signs and hand painting them, or having a sign painter paint them, or going to a letterpress shop and just distributing them. So I think part of the problem with graphic designers designing protest signs and having them available online, I think it's like that next step that I don't normally see would be actually distributing them. I feel like that gets them in more people's hands than just distributing them online, because most people outside of the design industry don't know about graphic design, or that these are available. I feel like. So I feel like there's that extra step that's usually missing, and I feel like that would be the best way to actually go about getting your protest signs out there versus having a bunch of hand-painted ones that just have individual messages.
Yeah, I like the reference to the history of protest signs. I think that's fantastic. From Portugal, we've got Fuel TV asking about, saying hello from Portugal and talking about books. Any books you guys recommend? I think you're thinking about books around protest or protest signs, or the history of protest movements, maybe.
That's a tough one. So there is a book that I like that's actually just called Protest. And it gives you this kind of this history of protest in a broader context, from protest signs to hand signs, like the history of the V sign, or the history of the fist, and just like all these different roles and symbols that revolve around protests in all different parts of the world. That's usually my go-to.
Yeah, that's great. I would point you towards something I read. I had seen a little while ago, but I hadn't seen for a while. And just looking at some of Tré's interviews, I picked up a link to Black Designers Missing in Action by Cheryl D. Miller, and the follow-up about Still Missing in Action. And I would say, if you haven't read those essays, they are fantastic. They're really, really fantastic. Or and a very reasonable account of the economic and sociological reasons why back when Dr. Miller, is it Dr. Miller? Cheryl Miller, first piece back in the late 60s or the early 70s. Tré, is that right?
Mid 80s, I think.
Oh, sorry, mid 80s. But why there were so few Black designers, and the reasons cited are just really fantastic. It's a really brilliantly argued piece, I'd say. So I would really suggest that. Simran Penmani is asking about international differences. So have you ever come across a time in your life when the project you've worked on has led to a different direction due to national laws and restrictions? And how can one deal with that? Has that happened to you, Tré?
Not yet. So far, EVA is the only international font that I've made, and which comes from Wikimedia Commons, which kind of prevented any international incident. I feel like photo licensing is like the hardest part of my job, just because of like what I'm highlighting, and images are so expensive. But fortunately, I haven't had an issue with that. The only thing that I'm really concerned about, that I'm still looking into, um, are like what the laws are around protest signs in other countries. For example, in America, I can make a font based off of anyone's protest sign because it's considered a public exhibition, which you can't copyright. So with that, I can literally make a font off of anyone's protest signs. But I'm not sure what the laws are around public exhibitions in other countries. So that I'm still looking into.
Fantastic. We've got some more questions. I think we'll probably just ask 2 or 3 more questions and then probably have to close the session. Some practical ones about giving some advice in terms of people towards the beginning of their career. From Hedy Percy, what do you think is a good way to approach a design or a company as a student? How do you gain their interest when you don't have years of work and experience?
Creative marketing. Like I still love mail. I know a lot of people still love mail. I feel like in a time where we get so many emails and barely have time to look through all of them, mail is probably the best way to market yourself. For example, when I was a student, I had a wax seal made to match my last name, and I would mail letters to people I wanted to work for.
Fantastic.
Or like I heard about someone who sent actual spam.
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 That's funny. So there's some advice there. Michelle's asking, how do you, Michelle, I think I pronounced that right. How do you structure your day to stay creative and productive? Are there things that help you stay concentrating, especially during the current pandemic? Great question.
Definitely. I always take a 15-minute break every hour or so just to stand up, stretch, go outside for a minute, just breathe fresh air. I feel like taking those small moments of clarity really kind of reinvigorate you and kind of help you think through any problems that are going on. I cloud watch if I really can't think of anything, or if I'm just kind of stuck, or if I just feel stuck. Yeah, that's probably the best thing to do in my opinion.
Fantastic. Andrew Campbell's asking, in terms of design inspiration, do you think we need to beware of the echo chamber of design research, design inspiration research?
Definitely, but it's so hard to do. Yeah, it's just really hard. I feel like it kind of goes back to that piece of advice where you just have to be interested in things outside of design. And I feel like anything outside of design can be your greatest influence, in terms of like just design inspiration. Like, what was it? I had a project that was actually for a sociologist while I was taking a sociology class in college. The day after I heard this talk where the guy was saying that every class you take is a future client. So I think it just goes back to being interested in anything outside of design.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to ask you a question as a writer, if you don't mind, because I think you're a writer as well as a typographer. I've read some of the things you've written, and the words you use are very deliberately chosen. Thought becomes words, words become actions, actions become habits, habits become character, character becomes destiny. I mean, that's a very crafted, a beautifully crafted sentence. So I think you're a speaker and a writer as well as a typographer. So you like what words do as well as the forms they take. And I did a project a few years back where it's a really unfair question actually, but I picked out some of my favorite words and did it as a talk. And I wonder if I could ask you to pick out a word or two that you love and maybe say why. And that's too hard a question.
Definitely one of my favorite words is light. So that was actually my first word. And yeah, that was my very first word was light. And my parents told me that.
Not mama, dada, light.
And yeah, and my parents telling me today it was that I was thinking up a logo, but I just couldn't express it. That's what else. Become is naturally one of my favorite words, just from that phrase that you mentioned. Sincere, I really love the word sincere. Definitely, and just like the history of the word is really interesting to me. Like when I was in the process of branding my studio, which ended up just being my name, Seals, I actually found out sincere just means without wax. From when people used to use wax seals.
Oh, how interesting. So you gravitated towards that word and you found the reason.
Definitely. And passion is a really interesting word to me too. Like for the longest time, I thought passion just meant that you like love what you do or like just a love for something, but it actually means to suffer for something. Like you love it so much that you're willing to suffer for it. So like you're willing to suffer for your work. Yeah. So that was a really interesting word.
I didn't know that. That's great. That's a great meaning.
Definitely.
Yeah, passion often is one of those words like purpose. I think sometimes we use those words quite lightly and really fully understand what they mean. So I think that's really great. That's a really great perspective. I'm just going to make an observation about you as a person, as a personality. I think there's a really interesting mix of qualities about you. I think one of the things that's fascinating about you is not just the work you do, but your manner. And on the one hand, you're sort of fighting for justice and you're engaged with the struggle. And yet on the other hand, you come across as such a calm person, so courteous in your manner. And can you sort of account for those different sides of yourself?
Definitely. I mean, I owe all of that to my parents. My dad is one of the most laid back people I've ever met in my life. I remember one time the weather report was on. They said there was a tornado coming our way. And my dad went outside and was like, and my mom was like, "What are you doing out there?" And my dad's like, "I'm watching to see if it's coming." My mom is just one of the most open people that I've ever met. She never meets a stranger ever. And I feel like I kind of owe all that to them. And then just my years of watching them and how they treat people and their business just kind of influenced everything I am.
Right. Well, that's great. That's great. Well, then they did a good job. They did a good job. I'm gonna close it now. I think thank you everyone for your questions, and thanks to everyone who was here listening to Tré and who had dinner with Tré this evening. And thanks Tré for being such a thoughtful and powerful voice. I think your words and your work are just a great. I think they're a great inspiration to people, creative people of all generations. Certainly to me. And to the next generation in particular, you really show what I think when you put talent and purpose and focus together, you really show what those together can accomplish. So I think this has been really tremendous. Our next dinner will be with the Bay Area's Instagram anarchist, the very brilliant Pablo Rochat. So please look out for that, which is happening towards the end of February. Until then, thank you so much to everyone who's come today, and especially to the wise and wonderful.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.